Welcome to the Elokus podcast. This is and where we explore the divine. That's the probably the essence of this podcast, which is probably making us pretty unique. In any case, this is class number 2 in the discourse Shlach Lecha Anashim, which is the fifth discourse in the overall book B'Shah Shehekdimu. And we are in the middle of chapter 18 in the general book, because the chapters continue on through the discourses. They don't start by each discourse over again. But here we go. So yesterday we began chapter 18, where he says that based on everything we've learned in the last discourse, in the discourse Nasa Yes Rosh, in which we had discussed that the lights, the shoirish, the root of the kav, the root of the thread of light that permeates the black hole and brings forth all the energy and all the life force of all of creation and all of existence, the life force of the cosmos, which first channels 10 lights into the 10 sephirot, which they are the building blocks of creation. So we were saying that both the lights that are in those vessels, in the 10 sephirot, that trace themselves to the kav, which is the thread, and the thread himself, all these have already somewhat of a design, a very subtle design. It's already predisposed, if we might say, to 10 attributes. And even before the black hole, even if we go before the tzimtzum, before the hiddenness, where God hides the infinite light, and we trace back into the infinite light that was first present, even over there is a source for the thread, for the kav. And what's that source? That's what he referred to as the lower end of the Or Ein Sof, which is what he called the 10 hidden spheres. Esses spheres agnuzos, the 10 hidden spheres, which would that tell us that there is 2 dimensions. It's not a sweeping level called the Or Ein Sof, where it's just one aspect of infinity and undefined and unrestricted and unrestrained energy, simple energy, but rather it is a little nuanced, and that there is two general dimensions. There is the level of the light where the light is utterly free, undefined, and from that place hypothetically can come infinite amount of sphirot, without an end types of emanations and projections. And then there is the lower end of it, which means once there is a desire that arose in the Ein Sof, in the Or Ein Sof, that he wants to create worlds, so that narrows the light already to be already predisposed to 10 spheres, as he calls it, the Esses spheres agnuzos. So once we've established that in the last chapter, based on that, he says, we will now continue, we will understand a concept mentioned in the Eitz Chaim. What does it say in Eitz Chaim? Eitz Chaim are the Kabbalistic writings of the Holy Ari. In Eitz Chaim, he presents a question. We know that what is Kabbalah 101, very basic idea of Kabbalah, of the teachings of the Holy Ari, that initially when the infinite light was present, before the whole process of creation begins, the infinite light was present. There wasn't any possibility for creation to happen. There wasn't even space for the creation, because God and his light filled all possible space. What happened? In order to create the world, God begins with a contraction. And he contracts the light totally. He brings the infinite light and hides it and retracts it back into himself, without leaving even a trace of that light, dimming it down to zero. And that creates what we call the black hole. The space. Black holes, in Kabbalah doesn't call it a black hole. In Kabbalah it's called Makom Cholol, the place of absence, the Chalal, the empty space. But since we're using the term light, so the absence of light, it's easy to refer to it as a black hole. Then into this black hole, into this empty space, into this vacancy, Hashem reintroduces the kav, which that becomes the thread of life force that will go and be the electricity line, if you might say, for the power line for all of creation and all of existence. Everything will be powered by the light of the kav, which is a reintroduction of the infinite light, albeit in a very narrow way, which is why it's called a kav, why it's called a thread and a light. So the Eitz Chaim questions this and asks, and he says like this, I don't get it. How come God had to remove the light completely, down to zero, that there was no trace of that infinite light at all? And then start from zero, start from nothing, have this empty black hole, and then reintroduce this beam of light. Why couldn't he, from the very get-go, remove, that's for sure, he has to remove the light, but let him dim it, and he would leave over just one tiny ray. Why make it completely dark without any light, not even the thread, without even that one narrow beam, and then bring back the beam after it's completely dark? Why couldn't he, or completely absent, why couldn't he just remove whatever was too much for the creation and leave over that one beam that was once obviously part of the infinite? Leave it over. And then you will use that to create the world. It seems like it would be an extra step to remove it completely and then bring it back. That was the question the Eitz Chaim says. And let me tell you the Eitz Chaim's answer. The Arizal's answer to that question is that had God allowed even one beam of his light to be present without ever removing that light, then the vessels could never come into existence. What happened during blackout, what happened when all the lights got shut and there was no revelation at all of the infinite, it was in that darkness that the vessels formed, that the basis of the vessels were able to get. And remember, we spoke that there is a concept called Rishimu. Rishimu is after you erase a light. There's no light at all, but after you erase a paper, you have a paper and you erase it completely, but there are slight traces that are left on that paper. If you look carefully on it, you take the paper and lift it up to the light, you can see small little traces left over that was once on this parchment or on this paper, something was written on it. And that's called Rishimu. And from these Rishimu, that's where, this is what forms the vessels. But in order for this Rishimu, for these traces that were left over, to form the vessels, they could only get those vessels produced when during lights out. If lights were not completely out, and there would be some leftover revelation, even if it would just be a narrow kav, but there would be a kav, which is this narrow beam of light, it would interfere in the forming of the vessels. And if you're going to ask the questions, but hold it, since that light was going to come back, shouldn't that light destroy the vessels? We find that there is a concept in Kabbalah that we speak of many times called Shviras HaKelim, where the vessels can't handle the light. If we're saying that the light is a contradiction to the vessels, and the vessels could not form if the light was present, so what are we gaining? We have lights out, so we form the vessels. But from vessels itself, nothing is created, as we discussed. We need energy. We have to pull the power line. So we pull back the light. We turn back on the light. Yes, a dim light, but we pull back on that light. And what are we pulling back? A light that had that light been present, the vessels would never be able to handle it. So we had to shut the light. So now you're back to square one, because the moment you'll turn on the light, you'll destroy the vessels. So the Eitz Chaim deals with that question. And what he says is, no. This that we say that the lights had to go completely out in order for the vessels to form is only to form the vessels. But once they're formed already, they can hold out even when the light returns. Of course, if the infinite light would return, it would utterly destroy those vessels. But it's not returning the infinite light in its full broadness. What's referring is only a narrow beam, if you might say, of that infinite light. A kav is returning. That the vessels can handle once the vessels have already been born into being vessels, once they exist already. But to form those vessels, to initiate their existence while the lights would be present, that you couldn't do. It's like, you're trying to listen to figure something out in your head. a concept, an idea, and someone is talking to you. So you say to the person who's talking to you, sorry, don't talk to me now, you're distracting me. But once you get once the concept is already, once you've thought it through and you're already built and you have the idea settled in your mind, then you're not going to say, oh, if you start talking to me, you're going to destroy my concept. No. Once it's already present and it's there, it's not going to get distracted. It's not going to get overwhelmed by if you're listening to something else. It's not going to break it. But during the time when the concept is forming in your head, you need the silence. Similar to that idea is this concept. Obviously, I'm making up that example. The examples that I give you most of the time are the examples that it says in the book. Yeah, it's my own example, so it's probably a very, very weak example. But just for this little idea that once something is in existence, it can handle more than it would need for it to form, and then it needs more space. It needs more quiet time. Okay, that's the answer that the Arizal gives. But he's not going to deal now with the answer. He's going to deal, the Rebbe, in the discourse that we're learning, what he's primarily going to deal with is not the answer, but the question. He is saying, I don't get what the Eitz Chaim is even asking. How can the Eitz Chaim, how can the Arizal even suggest that God could have left the beam in place without removing it? The question, what's the beam? The beam is the light that eventually the creation can handle. The universe can handle that beam. Obviously, to a certain degree. When you say the universe, we mean the spiritual universes. They're the first recipients, and then only a tiny little bit trickle. There's a drop of the ocean. Not even that is not a good example of how small it is, how minute it is. But eventually, something comes down to create the physical universe as well, right? But in general, the idea is that the light of the Kav is handleable by the creation, at least after it exists already, right? So after the vessels are here, it can handle this illumination. So if that's what the Kav is, then the question is like this. It's how can obviously the infinite light of God, the creations can't handle. This little beam, the creations could handle. That means that this limited beam, this beam is a certain limited type of energy versus the infinite energy, the pure infinite energy that is boundless. So the question is like this. Forget about vessels. How can you even differentiate this tiny little beam if without first coming to a zero? What does he mean by that? He says like this. Let's use, and he gives a very a beautiful example to understand this. You have a brilliant teacher. The brilliant teacher has a mind that is just on a complete different scale. His or her thoughts are so beyond the average person that there's no communication at all. There's no point of contact. I mean, their mind. Imagine a brilliant mind that is the AI artificial intelligence brain in 50 years. Imagine how crazy that computing power is going to be. So imagine a brilliant mind on that level. But it's just not okay. And obviously it comes in to teach average people. So when that teacher with that brilliant mind is going to teach, obviously they can't teach the concepts. They're rich, mind-blowing concepts that are totally beyond the scope of any normal brain. They can't, there's no communication, as we said earlier. But they were still asked to give a class. They still want to educate. They still want to make a difference to society. So what they obviously is going to have to find a small little something, a little nugget, if we might say, a little nugget of insight, a little afterthought, so to speak, small little, a crumb, a little crumb of their brain power, of their intelligence, that could be turned into a lecture series that will take 100 years to give over. It can write the biggest books and can educate the masses. But it obviously is only going to be one crumb of their brilliant mind. So, okay, you can do that. Teacher can do that, can find that crumb. But he says like this: in order for this brilliant mind to be able to find that crumb, as long as they have in their consciousness, in their brain focus, on their screen, use your computer screen as a screen. The screen means what is revealed. Your computer has tons of files and programs and all kinds of stuff that are there in present, but are not on the screen, which means they're not revealed. They're not occupying the face, the revealed space. So, in our minds, it means what's consciously in our mind. If the teacher would be thinking consciously in their mind, holding on to some, rich concept they're in the middle of developing. Again, this teacher, this brilliant mind, is holding in the middle of developing the most advanced concept ever. Imagine that. And while there is that brilliant, without shutting that down, keeping that open, they would have to search and find a little crumb because they're told, hey, they're waiting for you in the auditorium. Regular earthlings, regular human beings are there and they're waiting for you to teach something. There's no way the teacher can just clip a tiny little something and teach because there's no little something in their head. In their head, everything they're thinking, their entire head is filled with this brilliant light that is going to blind all the students. No one is going to have even one clue what they're talking. So what the teacher needs to do, really, is to shut their mind down. Basically, go to zero. They have to move everything out. They have to literally put everything in the recycle bin for now. Or shut down every window that's open on their screen. On their screen, which means in their mental consciousness. Shut down everything and come to a blank screen. The teacher has to hit a blank. Once the teacher hits a blank, then the teacher can think about the students, the type of people they're speaking to, and pull out this little crumb and deliver it, which means that in order to differentiate, the intelligence that is suitable for the student from the grand intelligence of the teacher, that requires a blank moment. Only in the blank moment can that differentiation be made. So this is used in, now, I am not such a brilliant mind, and I don't necessarily have this experience, but maybe I do. I'm not as a brilliant mind, but because I teach Hasidus, it's possible that this is an automatic, what's it called again, experience that I'm not conscious of. But definitely people that are on the level that we're talking about, these great super minds, and the Rabbeim who are teaching, the author of this book is definitely one of these, and like one of those super minds. So we can believe him that this is the process. The process is a complete dismissal of everything that they have, and then pull out the crumb that is suitable to the student. If that's the case, if we accept that as of the premise, we will relate that, obviously, on a billion gazillion times, not just zillion, infinitely times more, when we're referring to God. That God's infinite light, as the infinite light was present, they couldn't even, the light of the kav. What's the kav? The kav is the crumb that's going to illuminate and sustain all of the universes. That's going to become the intelligence of the universe. So, while the infinite light was present, the kav, it's not like there is a beam, the beam that later will be the beam that will beam out to the world is not distinguishable from the infinite light of God while the lights are turned on. For that reason, as we said earlier, the teacher needs to what? Shut their lights down completely, turn to blank. And that's exactly what we're saying that Tzimtzum had to happen. And precisely the first Tzimtzum, which we say, was a complete Tzimtzum. Later on in the process of creation, there are many latter Tzimtzumim, latter contractions, which are not going to pure blank. It's not going to pure emptiness, the lights out. It's just a process of dimming, of diminishment. But the first Tzimtzum is a complete silica or back to zero. And it's necessary, because or else you couldn't discover this little crumb, which is the kav, which will become the life force of all of creation. If so, the Rebbe is saying, I don't get the question of the Eitz Chaim. The Arizal is asking a question. That why did God have to shut the light down completely? He could have left over this small little crumb of light, this little kav. He could have left it over without dimming the light completely. And the only reason he had to dim was only for the formation of the vessels, like we said. But if not for the formation of the vessels, if not for that technical problem of something other business that God needed to do, but just in order to separate the light for creation, he could have done that without going down to zero. The Rebbe is saying, well, how can we say that? How would that be possible? Just like a teacher cannot differentiate the lesson for the class unless they shut their higher caliber intelligence, shut it down completely. So of course God would seemingly need to do the same. So then we don't understand the question of the Ari, that the Ari even poses such a possibility. But based on what we said earlier, we will answer that. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. Based on what we learned in the last chapter, we will be able to answer that question. So now let's read it inside. This is in the beginning of chapter 18, literally like 4 lines in. And at first glance, it's not understood. It's not understood. It's explained in many places. In order that there should be a revelation of the light that has a relationship to the worlds. There needed to be a removal and a concealment of the light completely. And as it is known, the mashal, which is the metaphor, that when someone is transmitting intelligence, because in the intelligence of the teacher, when the teacher is for himself, or it's not identifiable, it's not distinguishable. The light, the teaching, that has a relationship to the recipient. And the only way that the teacher can even find that, can even detect that. And through this, that the teacher completely shuts down every bit of light that's in their mind, or as we said earlier, clears their screen, clears the deck completely. They hide their light completely. Azai then, nivdal, it can be separated, v'nikar ha'or, and it becomes recognizable, the light, hashayach el makabel, that has a relationship, or that's which is possible for the recipient to be able to receive. V'imkein, and if so, lefizeh, according to this, eichoya efsher, how can there even be such a suggestion? Sheyishar oirakav, that there should be a remaining leftover light of the kav. Without requiring the light to completely vacate. That's what did happen. The light completely vacated. But the Arizal is answering that was only necessary for vessels. But for the energy that will later become part of the energy of creation, which would be considered like the teacher's lesson, that wouldn't require a complete removal of what was before. But he's asking, how can we say that? Of course it requires that, because God created us, by the way, to operate in a way similar to himself. So by knowing the way things work within ourselves, we can know him. That's one of the reasons he created it, because he wants to be in a relationship with us. So just like in the human experience, that where the distance between the teacher and the student is far less than the distance between God and his creations. And even in that far lesser equation between teacher and student, we still can imagine that a great teacher needs to close down their light, their illumination, their brain power, their intellectual understanding, and shut it down completely before they can pick a little nugget for a little crumb for their students. So for God, it's for sure should be that way. Meaning in the sense that his light should interfere with the ability to find and break off a tiny little piece. However, based on what we learned earlier, he says, now we'll understand. Because if we are to agree that, if we are to say that the kav, the lesson that's going to the student, that's the kav. That's the transmission that's going. In this case, the student would be the general cosmos, everything that is created, all the worlds, spiritual and physical, everything together. That's the student. The teacher obviously is the Ein Sof, the infinite one. And the kav is what? The lesson that's going to the student, which is the little crumb. So he's saying, if we learn that the kav, as it comes from the infinite light, is plugging in directly from the infinity of the teacher, from the infinity of God, then you would be right. Then the Arizal's hypothetical question would not be understood. Why is he asking that? How would that even be possible? The Arizal's suggestion, where the Arizal is suggesting to God not to shut down the light completely, but to allow the ray to remain. That would be impossible, because you can't distinguish a limited light from an infinite source. You can't distinguish it. However, since we learned earlier that even before the tzimtzum, the infinite light itself is nuanced, the infinite light itself has within it a nether level, stage B, if you might say, which is, the light is still infinite, but it has already 10 hidden sphirot, which means it's already narrowed to a certain degree, as opposed to the broad infinity of the infinite light in its original state. The second level that we spoke earlier, the lower level, and that's the source of the kav, comes right. So comes out. So the question then of the Eitz Chaim is as follows. This is what that Arizal means to ask. Of course, the grandiose infinite light, that God has to remove completely. But why did God shut down all of the infinite light, the higher dimension of the infinite light and the lower dimension of the infinite light? God took a sweeping might say removal of every trace of Or Ein Sof. That's what it says. Tzimtzum Rishon was a removal of all of the infinite light. Why did he have to do that? He could have, all he needed to do was to remove the infinity of the infinite light and allow the source of the kav of the infinite light. That means the infinite light that carries particular 10 sphirot, that to remain. And from there, he can emanate the kav. From there, he can emanate the kav, which is the lesson to the student, without having to shut down. So perhaps we can give an example from a teacher, let's say a great brilliant mind, who has, it's like an awesome, like incomprehensible ideas. That's only relevant to him and 3 geeks, like the teacher, right? Like right. However, this teacher has in their head also more simpler ideas. Let's say before they became such a brilliant mind, they authored some books and they have some ideas. They have stored away in their mind already, if you might say, ideas and concepts for regular folks. And then I'll give you. Let me give an example of how it would be possible. Let's imagine that it was, there are stories in stories told in Jewish history where there were simple people who, for whatever reason, did this very, very great, stunning mitzvah, and they merited that Elijah the prophet revealed themselves to them, and said to them that because you did such a selfless act, you've merited that I should come teach you Torah, or that some other tzaddik will teach you Torah and reveal to you the deepest secrets. So here you have an example of an ordinary person who suddenly becomes a big saint and a huge genius. His mind opens up suddenly, gifted with incredible higher knowledge. So you can imagine that a person like this doesn't forget everything they've always known. So they had some inspiration, which are more common and more something that they can relate to others. So imagine such a teacher. Do they have to shut down everything, bring their mind to absolute zero in order to be able to teach? No, they can say, hey, that book that I once wrote, that children's book, or That can be taught. It's only if the teacher never ever related, doesn't have any ideas in their heads that are for normal people, for normal small links, small guys. And they were born prodigies. They were from their very onset, they have brilliant, only these grandiose ideas. So someone like that, of course, can't distinguish a simple thing unless they shut their mind down altogether. But someone who has already, so they wouldn't have to go through this. Of course, as long as they're deeply thinking in their great in their new thinking, and as long as right now they're preoccupied with these grand ideas, of course, while they're thinking that, then they can't administer the lower teaching. But all it would mean is that I'm not thinking those teachings, and I don't have to shut my mind down completely. So that's what he's saying now. Since we say that the Kav has a source in the Or Ein Sof, which is not the same level of Or Ein Sof, where it's pure infinity, where the brilliance is just absolute brilliance, simple light that has no definitions at all, as we called later, Spheros Ein Kates, infinite Sphirot. That level, yeah, of course, that would not be able to project the Kav. And that we agree on, that has to be hidden. But the question of the Eitz Chaim is, God could have left the lower element of the Ein Sof, which is the Essa Spheres Hagnuzais, without shutting that down, and from there emanate the Kav. And the answer to that is that if that light would never have been gone to zero, then the Kalim would never have been able to form. Yes, the light of the Kav would be able to come from the Essa Spheres Hagnuzais, the 10 hidden Spheres, would be able to produce the Kav without shutting down. It could have been a continuation of the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum without having shutting down completely. The reason it was necessary was because of the Kalim, because of the vessels. But for the Kav's sake, it wasn't necessary. We could have pulled the Kav, and that was the question. And it therefore is a good question. Without having developed the idea that we said before. In other words, if we would argue and say that before the Tzimtzum, everything is just a simple infinite light, and there's no beginning to Essa Spheres Hagnuzais, then the Arizal's question would really not make any sense. It wouldn't be possible to pull a Kav from that infinite light. But since there is, we might say, grade A and grade B in the Or Ein Sof. So once we've already established that, so from grade B of the Or Ein Sof, we should be able to pull the Kav without shutting down completely. I have a question on this answer, which I'm not going to share with you today. I might share it tomorrow if I still have the question tomorrow. I'm being bothered already 2 days by this question, and I haven't figured it out. But maybe you will have the same question. And then if I don't have the answer to it, then I'll probably pose the question tomorrow, and we'll see. But in any case, we're getting late over here. This is the answer, but we're going to read the answer tomorrow inside because I don't want to pull the class too much longer. Okay, we're holding by about Pianal. Really already explained the next few lines, but let's leave it to me. We'll let Mashiach be here today.